Hey everyone, I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I want to share what's been going on in my life because, honestly, it feels like I've been living in a soap opera. This is the kind of story you hear about happening to other people, but never think it would happen to you. Well, it did, and I'm still trying to process it all. So here goes. A little backstory first. My dad passed away when I was 15. It was sudden and unexpected. After he was gone, it was just me and my mom. We were left in a good financial position. My dad had life insurance and a pretty decent estate. At the time, I didn't understand much about our finances, but I knew we weren't struggling. My mom handled everything, and I didn't think twice about it because she was grieving too, and I figured she was just doing her best. Things started getting weird after I graduated college. I was eager to move out and start my own life, but my mom had a different plan. She suggested I move back home for a bit to save money. She framed it like she was trying to help me get on my feet, saying it was just temporary until I found a better job or saved up for a place of my own. It seemed like a good idea at the time, especially since rent in my city is insane. I moved back in, thinking it would be a temporary arrangement. That's when the subtle manipulation began. It didn't feel like control at first, more like she was being overly helpful. My mom suggested we open a joint savings account to help me save for a down payment on a house. She said it would be easier for her to help manage my savings. It sounded logical at the time, so I agreed. I mean, she's my mom, why wouldn't I trust her? But soon after, I noticed she was monitoring the account activity constantly. If I took out money to go out with friends or buy something for myself, she'd ask why I was spending that money. It was always framed as concern, but it started to feel suffocating. I brushed it off though, telling myself she was just looking out for me. It escalated from there. My mom began giving me financial advice, unasked for and quite forcefully. She'd suggest I invest in certain stocks or mutual funds she had researched. She was always insistent, and if I didn't follow her suggestions, she'd get upset. She'd say things like, "I'm just trying to help you secure your future. Why don't you trust me?" It made me feel guilty, so I often just went along with it to keep the peace. Then came the gifts. My mom insisted on paying for my car insurance and health insurance. It was presented as a kind gesture, something she could do for me while I was saving up. But it came with strings attached. If I disagreed with her about anything, she'd bring up how she was covering these expenses for me. It became a way for her to control me, to keep me indebted to her. It was subtle at first, but it became more obvious over time. When I finally brought up the idea of moving out, she completely flipped. She started crying, talking about how lonely she was and how I was abandoning her after everything she'd done for me. She made it clear that if I moved out, I'd be hurting her deeply. It felt like emotional blackmail, but I ended up staying because I didn't want to deal with the guilt. A few months later, she came to me with a request. She asked me to co-sign a personal loan for her, saying it was for a home renovation project. I hesitated, but she made such a dramatic scene, crying and accusing me of not caring about the house or about her, that I caved in and signed. I thought it would be fine since she was so sure she could pay it back. I trusted her. That's when I started noticing some suspicious mail. Letters were arriving addressed to both of us, but when I asked her about it, she brushed it off as routine paperwork. I didn't think much of it until I started seeing credit card offers in my name. I knew I hadn't applied for any new credit cards, so I asked her directly. She played it off like it was no big deal, and that maybe I had forgotten applying for them, or that it was a mistake. One day I got a call from a debt collection agency. They were asking about an overdue payment on a credit card I didn't even know existed. I was confused and panicked. I immediately checked my credit report and was shocked to find multiple credit cards and loans in my name, with significant balances. It added up to tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I confronted my mom about it, expecting her to be as surprised as I was. Instead, she flipped the narrative, accusing me of being irresponsible. She claimed I must have applied for these cards and forgotten about it, maybe while I was out drinking with friends. It was like she was gaslighting me, making me question my own memory and sanity. That was my breaking point. I decided to consult a lawyer to figure out what was going on. After reviewing the documents in my credit report, the lawyer confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My mom had been systematically opening credit cards and taking out loans in my name without my knowledge. She was committing financial fraud against me, her own son. Before I could fully process this betrayal, my mom started rallying the extended family. She painted me as ungrateful and mentally unstable, claiming I was trying to ruin her life for no reason. The phone calls and texts started pouring in from relatives, scolding me for how I was treating my poor, loving mother. I felt completely alone, but I wasn't about to give up. My lawyer advised me to start gathering evidence. While going through old documents, I found an unopened letter addressed to me from my dad's lawyer. It was dated a few months after he passed away. I opened it, and what I read inside shook me to my core. It hinted at a trust fund set up by my dad, something I had never been told about, and it made me realize there was a lot more my mom was hiding from me. This was only the beginning. Update 1. After finding the letter from my dad's lawyer, I knew I had to get answers. I made an appointment with the lawyer listed in the letter, an older man who had been handling my father's estate for decades. When I arrived at his office, he didn't seem surprised to see me. It was almost like he'd been expecting this visit for years. He pulled out a file with my name on it, thick with documents. The lawyer explained that my dad had set up a trust fund specifically for me before he passed away. It was meant to be accessible when I turned 25, no strings attached. But according to the paperwork, my mother had intervened shortly after I turned 18. She submitted a letter claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own finances, essentially blocking my access to the trust. He showed me the letter. It was signed by my mother and a supposed witness, someone I didn't even recognize. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All those years of her pushing me to stay at home, insisting she was helping me with my savings, it was all part of her plan to keep me dependent. I didn't waste any time. I asked the lawyer to schedule a meeting with my mother right there in his office so she couldn't dodge the confrontation. The meeting happened the next day. As soon as my mother walked in, she put on her usual act, sweet, concerned, playing the part of a loving mother who just wanted the best for her child. But as soon as the lawyer brought up the trust fund, her demeanor changed. She went from calm to defensive in seconds. She started crying, accusing me of betraying her, saying she only blocked the trust because she was worried I'd waste the money. She turned to the lawyer and began pleading, making it seem like I was the problem, that I was unstable, irresponsible. But the lawyer didn't buy it. He calmly told her that what she did was illegal and that I had the right to access my own funds. My mother stormed out, but I knew this was just the beginning. Within hours, my phone started blowing up. Family members I hadn't spoken to in months were suddenly messaging me, furious. My mother had already gotten to them. She was telling everyone that I was trying to take away her money, that I was being greedy and ungrateful. I was getting calls and texts accusing me of being heartless, of trying to destroy my poor mother who had sacrificed everything for me. I didn't know what else to do, so I turned to Reddit. I posted my story in a popular subreddit that focuses on family drama, hoping for some advice. The response was overwhelming. People were furious on my behalf, calling out the manipulation and abuse. They gave me great advice. Some even suggested specific legal steps I could take to protect myself. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't crazy, like there were people out there who understood what was happening. I followed the advice from Reddit and contacted my bank. With my lawyer's help, I initiated a fraud investigation. The bank started reviewing my accounts and flagged several suspicious activities tied directly to my mother. It wasn't just the joint savings account. There were multiple unauthorized transfers and withdrawals. A few days later, my mother showed up at my workplace completely unannounced. She was crying, demanding we talk it out. It was a full-blown scene. She begged me to come outside, saying we could fix everything if I just dropped this whole nonsense with the lawyer. I refused to leave the office, and she ended up causing such a scene that security had to escort her out. My lawyer sent her a cease and desist letter the next day. It was a formal warning, telling her to stop contacting me and to stay away from my financial accounts. But the situation kept escalating. I found out she had opened a new line of credit in my name with a shady lender, racking up nearly $50,000 in debt. This was beyond anything I had imagined. Just when I felt like I was drowning in all this chaos, I got an unexpected call from my aunt, my dad's sister. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She said she'd heard what was happening and wasn't surprised. She told me that my mother had a history of manipulating people, even before my dad passed away. It was the first time anyone from the family had actually offered me support. While I was trying to wrap my head around this, my mother started posting cryptic messages on Facebook. She was making herself look like the victim, saying things like, "Some people just don't appreciate what you do for them," and "betrayal from those you love is the worst kind of pain." Her friends, and even some of my own relatives were commenting with sympathy, completely buying her version of events. Then I got an email from her. It was a long, rambling message filled with emotional manipulation. She claimed she only took control of my finances because she was worried about my future, that she was just trying to help me make smart choices. She even implied that without her, I would have ended up homeless or broke. It was classic gaslighting, making me question my own decisions and memories. My lawyer, meanwhile, was uncovering more evidence. He found several loan documents with my forged signature. My mother had gone to great lengths to keep this hidden, but the paper trail was there. We decided it was time for a family meeting. Not because I wanted to resolve things, but because I needed to confront this head-on with everyone present. The meeting was a disaster from the start. My mom put on another performance, crying and accusing me of trying to ruin her life. I presented the evidence, bank statements, forged documents, everything. The room went silent. My mother's tears turned to anger, and she had a full-blown meltdown, screaming that I was lying, that I'd regret this. As I left the meeting, she yelled after me, "You'll regret this when you find out the truth." It was a cryptic, chilling threat, and I have no idea what she meant by it. But I know one thing, this isn't over yet. Update 2. A week after the explosive family meeting, I got a letter in the mail. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of before, definitely not my mom's usual lawyer. I opened it and couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a cease and desist letter from a high-powered attorney representing my mother. The letter accused me of running a defamation campaign against her, claiming I was spreading lies and attempting to ruin her reputation. They even threatened to sue me for emotional distress if I didn't retract my statements and apologize. This felt like a last-ditch effort from my mother to scare me into silence. Instead of panicking, I updated my Reddit post with everything that had happened, including details about the legal threat. The response was insane. The post blew up almost immediately, with hundreds of people offering advice. Many shared similar experiences and urged me not to back down. Several users even connected me with fraud specialists who had seen cases like this before. My lawyer and I decided it was time for a deep dive into my financial records. We pulled every credit report we could find, combed through bank statements, and scrutinized every transaction. What we uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. The identity theft had been going on for at least 5 years. There were loans, credit cards, and even a car lease, all in my name. The total debt was over $100,000. I was floored. How had this gone on for so long without me noticing? The most shocking part was that my older sister, Jessica, was listed as an authorized user on several of the accounts. I hadn't spoken to Jessica much over the past few years. We were never close, and she'd always seemed to side with my mother on everything. I called her up, asking her point blank about the accounts. She sounded surprised at first, but then her tone changed. She got defensive, saying she had no idea what I was talking about. Something about her reaction felt off. I decided to confront her in person. When I showed up at her apartment with the documents, she broke down almost immediately. Jessica admitted that our mother had roped her into the scheme years ago. Mom had promised to help pay off Jessica's student loans in exchange for her help managing the fraudulent accounts. Jessica had been adding expenses to the credit cards and signing off on loan applications, all while pretending she was oblivious. Jessica begged me not to take legal action against her. She insisted she was manipulated and trapped, just like I was. It was hard to hear, but I knew I needed her testimony if I had any hope of winning this case. I told her I wouldn't press charges against her if she agreed to help me expose the full extent of what our mother had done. Around this time, I got a call from my aunt, the same one who had reached out to me with support earlier. She warned me about a filing cabinet in my mother's office. My aunt said she'd seen our mom stash important documents in there before, and it might contain evidence we could use. It felt risky, but I decided to go for it. I knew my mother would be out of the house for most of the day, so I went over and let myself in with the spare key I still had. The filing cabinet was locked, but it only took a few tries to get it open with a paperclip. Inside, I found a treasure trove of documents, bank statements, loan applications, and a stack of letters. One of them stood out. It was addressed to the trust fund's legal custodians and signed by my mother, claiming that I was mentally unfit to handle my finances. The witness signature was Jessica's. This was a smoking gun, proof that they had colluded to keep me from accessing my own money. As I kept digging, I found something even more disturbing. A letter from my dad, written to the lawyer who managed the trust fund. In it, he expressed concerns about my mother's behavior, saying he feared she would try to manipulate the trust fund after his death. It was like he had seen this coming and tried to protect me, but it still wasn't enough. With all this new evidence, my lawyer sent a counter letter to my mother's attorney, including copies of the forged documents and fraudulent transactions. Less than 24 hours later, her lawyer dropped the case. It was clear they wanted nothing to do with the mess my mother had created once they saw the extent of the evidence against her. The fallout was immediate. I shared the documents with the rest of the family, and suddenly, the phone calls and accusatory messages stopped. Some relatives reached out to apologize, admitting they had been manipulated by my mother's lies. It felt like a small victory, but the real battle was still ahead. Jessica showed up at my place a few days later in tears. She admitted she felt trapped by our mother for years and apologized for her role in everything. It wasn't easy to hear, but I knew I needed her testimony. I told her she could make things right by helping me in court. Meanwhile, my story on Reddit started gaining even more traction. It was shared across multiple subreddits and caught the attention of a few news outlets. Journalists began reaching out, wanting to interview me. I declined, choosing instead to focus on the legal case. But the support from the online community was overwhelming. People were rooting for me, and it gave me the strength to keep going. Then, the voicemail started. My mother left dozens, alternating between crying and begging for forgiveness to making veiled threats about how I'd regret dragging this into the public eye. It was clear she was spiraling, and I knew things were about to get even messier. The final straw came when I received a small package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a flash drive labeled Truth. I plugged it into my computer, and what I saw made my jaw drop. It was a video of my mother sitting alone, admitting to everything, the fraud, the manipulation, the lies. She looked directly into the camera and said, "It's all mine anyway. I did what I had to do." I knew right then that this video would be the key to everything. The courtroom showdown was coming, and I was finally ready. Update 3. A few days after the flash drive reveal, I started getting calls from extended family members again. This time, they weren't just accusatory, they were demanding a family meeting, saying we needed to resolve this before it got any worse. They claimed they wanted to mediate and help us find common ground. It felt like a trap, but my lawyer advised me to go, as long as I was prepared. I knew what this was, another attempt by my mother to manipulate the narrative. So I brought copies of all the evidence, and my lawyer came with me as a silent observer. The meeting was held at my cousin's house, a neutral location chosen by the family. When I walked in, the room was packed with relatives. My mother was sitting at the center, looking tearful and fragile. Before I could even sit down, she launched into her usual sob story. She painted herself as the loving, concerned mother who had only taken control of my finances because she was worried about my reckless spending. She spun a tale about how she'd tried her best to guide me and how I was now turning against her in the most hurtful way imaginable. I waited for her to finish, letting her dig her own hole. The relatives around her nodded sympathetically, casting judgmental looks in my direction. It was clear they had all been fed her side of the story before this meeting. Just as I was about to start presenting my side, a voice interrupted from the back of the room. It was my estranged uncle, my dad's brother. I hadn't seen him in years. He stepped forward and announced that he'd come because he couldn't stay silent any longer. He revealed that he had distanced himself from the family after seeing how manipulative my mother had been, even while my dad was alive. He shared stories about how she had tried to control every aspect of my dad's business and finances, and how my dad had confided in him, expressing fears about what she might do after he passed away. This unexpected ally changed the tone of the entire room. My mother's face turned pale, and she quickly tried to redirect the narrative, claiming my uncle was just trying to stir up trouble. But the damage was done. The room was no longer fully on her side. I took the opportunity to present the evidence I had brought. I laid out copies of the forged letters, the fraudulent loan applications, and the credit card statements. I explained how my mother had been opening accounts in my name for years and blocking my access to the trust fund. The room fell silent as I showed them the documents. The sympathetic nods she had received earlier were gone, replaced by looks of shock and disbelief. Then came the most surprising moment of the meeting. Jessica, my older sister, stood up. She looked nervous, her hands shaking slightly. She took a deep breath and admitted everything. She confessed that our mother had roped her into the scheme years ago, promising to help pay off her student loans if she helped manage the fraudulent accounts. Jessica revealed that the plan was always to use my trust fund money to cover her debts and legal issues, while keeping me in the dark. My mother couldn't control herself any longer. She jumped up, screaming at Jessica, calling her a traitor and accusing her of destroying the family. It was chaos. Relatives were trying to calm her down, while others were demanding to know why she had lied to them. My uncle stepped in, physically blocking her from lunging at Jessica. He turned to me and nodded, as if to say, "Now's your chance." I pulled out the flash drive and plugged it into my laptop, projecting the video onto the TV screen in the room. The silence was deafening as everyone watched. In the video, my mother sat alone, speaking directly into the camera. She admitted to manipulating my finances and blocking my access to the trust fund. Her exact words were, "It's all mine anyway. Op wouldn't have made anything of himself without me." The room erupted. Some relatives immediately sided with me, horrified by what they had just witnessed. Others were still in disbelief, accusing me of being cruel for exposing the family's dirty laundry. The division was clear, lines were being drawn. Those who had been on my mother's side now had to confront the reality of her actions. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore, it was undeniable proof. I updated my Reddit post that night, sharing what had happened at the intervention. The response was massive. People were offering legal advice, with several lawyers even reaching out to offer their help pro bono. The support gave me the confidence I needed to take the next step. My lawyer wasted no time filing a restraining order against my mother, citing harassment and continued threats. The judge granted it, marking a small but significant victory. But my mother didn't back down. She started a smear campaign online, posting her own twisted version of events on Facebook. She accused me of elder abuse and claimed I was trying to destroy her life out of spite. It was exhausting, but I knew I had to keep pushing forward. A few days later, Jessica approached me with a deal. She said she'd testify against our mother in court if I agreed to help her avoid criminal charges. It was a risky move, but I agreed, knowing her testimony could be the key to winning this case. Then, my uncle dropped one last bombshell before leaving town. He pulled me aside and told me there was a second trust fund my father had set up in secret. It was designed to be protected from my mother's influence and was meant to activate once I turned 30. It was another layer of security my dad had put in place, almost as if he knew this day might come. As the meeting ended, the family was split down the middle. I decided to go completely no contact with those who still sided with my mother. My lawyer called me later that day with more news. My mother was now under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The court date was set. This was it. The final battle was about to begin, and I knew it was my last chance to expose everything. Update 4. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. I showed up early with my lawyer, clutching a thick folder of evidence. The courthouse was packed, family members, spectators, and even a few journalists who'd picked up on the story from my viral Reddit posts. My mother was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with a new lawyer by her side, someone she must have hired last minute. She looked calm, almost smug, like she believed she still had a chance to win this. The proceedings began, and my mother's lawyer launched into their opening statement. He painted me as an ungrateful son, claiming I had a history of reckless spending and poor financial decisions. He argued that all the actions my mother took were out of love and concern, framing it as her protecting me from myself. I could see some of the family members in the gallery nodding along, clearly influenced by her ongoing manipulation. Then it was our turn. My lawyer started presenting the evidence, laying out the timeline of the identity theft, the forged documents, and the fraudulent loans. It was a lot to take in, and the judge listened intently, asking pointed questions. The tension in the room was thick, but I knew the real bombshells were yet to come. The first key witness was Jessica. She took the stand, looking visibly nervous. I could see her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. She began by explaining her involvement, how our mother had manipulated her into signing the documents, promising to help pay off her student loans. Jessica admitted to signing forged papers and becoming an authorized user on the fraudulent credit cards. She looked directly at me as she spoke, tears welling up, but she pressed on, detailing how she felt trapped and pressured by her mother. The courtroom was silent. Even my mother's lawyer looked taken aback by Jessica's honesty. My mother, on the other hand, was fuming. I could see her whispering frantically to her lawyer, but there was nothing she could do. Jessica's testimony was damning, and it was clear the judge was taking it seriously. Then, in a surprising move, my mother decided to testify herself. It was risky, and I could tell her lawyer wasn't thrilled about it. She started off calm, trying to play the victim card once again. She talked about how hard it was raising 2 kids on her own after my dad passed away, how she had only taken control of the finances to protect me because she believed I wasn't capable of handling it. But the facade didn't last. When my lawyer began cross-examining her about the forged documents, she started losing her temper. Her voice rose, and the mask slipped. She snapped, saying that I didn't deserve the money, that I would have squandered it if she hadn't intervened. The courtroom was stunned. It was as if she couldn't hold back her true feelings any longer. She practically shouted, "It's all mine anyway." Op would have wasted it on something stupid. My lawyer seized the moment and presented the flash drive. We had set up a monitor, and the judge allowed us to play the video. Everyone watched as my mother's face appeared on the screen, sitting in what looked like her living room. In the video, she confessed everything, how she had blocked access to the trust fund, manipulated Jessica, and opened credit lines in my name. Her exact words echoed through the courtroom, "It's all mine anyway." Op wouldn't have made anything of himself without me. There was a collective gasp in the room. My mother's lawyer slumped in his chair, clearly defeated. My mother went pale, then red, and finally broke down sobbing. She tried to play the victim again, but it was too late. The judge interrupted, demanding order in the courtroom. The damage was done, and everyone knew it. Just when I thought it couldn't get more intense, my estranged uncle, who had been sitting quietly at the back, asked to be called as a witness. He walked up to the stand and pulled out a letter. He explained that it was from my father, written shortly before he passed away. In the letter, my dad had expressed concerns about my mother's manipulative behavior. He'd asked his brother, my uncle, to keep an eye on the trust fund, fearing that my mother might try to take control of it. The courtroom was in shock. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The judge called a brief recess, allowing everyone to collect themselves before continuing. When we resumed, my lawyer presented the final pieces of evidence, bank statements and credit reports, showing the clear pattern of financial abuse and unauthorized loans taken out in my name. By this point, news of the case had spread. Journalists were taking notes, and I could see people in the gallery whispering to each other, clearly siding with me now that all the facts were out. The judge reviewed everything carefully before making his ruling. He declared my mother guilty of fraud, identity theft, and financial abuse. He ordered full restitution of all misappropriated funds and restored my control over the trust fund immediately. It was an overwhelming victory. I felt a wave of relief as the judge granted a permanent restraining order against my mother, citing her history of harassment and manipulation. As the ruling was read, my mother lost control. She stood up, screaming accusations and threats at me, claiming I had betrayed her and ruined her life. Security had to escort her out of the courtroom as she continued to yell, her voice echoing down the hall. The entire room was left in stunned silence. After the verdict, Jessica approached me in the hallway. She was crying, apologizing over and over. She admitted she had felt trapped and manipulated for years, afraid of what would happen if she defied our mother. I accepted her apology but told her it would take time to rebuild any trust. As the courtroom emptied, I received mixed reactions from my extended family. Some hugged me, expressing regret for doubting me. Others avoided eye contact, embarrassed by how easily they had been fooled. I left the courthouse feeling drained but relieved. When I got home, I saw a missed call from an unknown number. The voicemail was from my mother's lawyer. His voice sounded serious. "There's one last thing you should know. Call me back if you want the truth." I stared at my phone, unsure of what to do next. This nightmare wasn't over yet. Update 5. After the courtroom chaos, I sat at home staring at the missed call from my mother's lawyer. The voicemail was cryptic. "There's one last thing you should know. Call me back if you want the truth." I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I had to make that call. When I dialed the number, the lawyer got straight to the point. He revealed a final twist. There was a secret clause in the trust fund documents. If my mother had successfully proven that I was mentally unfit, she would have gained control of the entire estate. Apparently, she had been working towards this for years, fabricating the narrative of my supposed instability to seize control. The lawyer admitted he hadn't known about the fraudulent documents she submitted until it was too late. It was chilling, but it also made everything crystal clear. Her entire scheme, all the manipulation, was aimed at triggering this clause. Not long after, I received an email from my mother's legal team offering a settlement. They proposed a substantial payout but included a strict non-disclosure agreement (NDA). The NDA would bar me from ever speaking about what happened publicly. It was a tempting amount of money, but I knew accepting it would mean burying the truth. After everything I'd been through, there was no way I was going to let her silence me. Instead, I went back to Reddit and shared the entire story in full detail. I posted everything, the fraudulent documents, the court proceedings, and even the final settlement offer. The post went viral almost immediately. People were shocked by the extent of the deception, but they were also incredibly supportive. Thousands of comments poured in sharing similar experiences, and many users expressed relief at seeing justice served. It felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders as the truth finally came out. Jessica decided to make a public apology of her own. She posted a long, heartfelt message on her social media, taking full responsibility for her role in the scheme. She admitted to being complicit but explained the immense pressure she had faced from our mother. The post gained a lot of traction, and surprisingly, many people expressed sympathy for her situation. It seemed like everyone could see that she was just another pawn in our mother's twisted game. In the days following, several family members who had previously sided with my mother started reaching out. They apologized for their behavior, saying they had been manipulated by her lies. While it felt good to receive their apologies, I made it clear that I wasn't going to let anyone manipulate me again. I accepted their apologies but set firm boundaries, making it clear that I wouldn't tolerate any further interference. A few days later, my uncle asked to meet privately. He had something important to tell me. We met at a quiet cafe, and he handed me a stack of documents. He explained that my father had set up a second trust fund as a backup. This one was designed specifically to be protected from my mother's influence. It was supposed to activate once I turned 30, but given the circumstances, my uncle had expedited the process. It was a substantial amount, enough to secure my financial future. It felt like a final gift from my dad, a safeguard he had put in place knowing that something like this might happen. Not long after, I received an unexpected package from an estranged aunt. Inside was a collection of letters from my father. He had written them to me before he passed away, but they had been kept hidden all these years. The letters were filled with advice, encouragement, and his hopes for my future. Reading them was bittersweet, it felt like a final goodbye, but it also brought me a sense of closure I didn't realize I needed. Meanwhile, my mother's situation went from bad to worse. With the court ruling and all the evidence of fraud and identity theft, she faced criminal charges. Her reputation was ruined, and she was forced to declare bankruptcy. It was a sad end for her, but it was also the inevitable consequence of her own actions. I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness, realizing just how far she had been willing to go to control me. Emily and I decided it was time for a fresh start. We found a small, cozy apartment in a new city and made the move together. It was the clean break I needed, away from all the toxic memories. We spent our days exploring the new neighborhood, setting up our new home, and focusing on building a life together. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I started attending therapy regularly, diving deep into the trauma of my past. It wasn't easy, but I began to unpack all the manipulation and control I'd endured. Each session felt like shedding another layer of the burden I'd been carrying. Slowly but surely, I started to feel lighter, more hopeful about my future. I made one final post on Reddit, updating everyone on the resolution of the case. I thanked the community for their unwavering support and for giving me the strength to stand up for myself. The post blew up, receiving an outpouring of positive comments and messages. It felt like a fitting end to this chapter of my life. Before cutting ties with the rest of the family, I sent a final message to the family group chat. I explained my decision to go no contact permanently. I wished them well but made it clear that I needed to focus on my own healing and moving forward. It was a tough message to send, but it was necessary. A few weeks later, during a quiet dinner at our new apartment, Emily pulled out a small box. Without any grand gestures, she simply asked me to marry her. I was caught off guard but knew my answer immediately. I said yes. It was a simple, sincere moment, but it marked the start of a new chapter for us, one free from the weight of my past. I shared one last update on Reddit, letting everyone know about the proposal and thanking the community once again for their support. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and it felt like the perfect note to end on. I finally feel free. I've moved forward without the shadows of manipulation and control, ready to embrace a future that's mine to shape. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and reclaim your life. To anyone going through something similar, keep fighting. It gets better. I'm a 35-year-old guy, and my wife is 34. We have a 2-year-old son named Ethan, and we live in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My wife and I have been married for about 5 years now, and things were going pretty smoothly until recently. There's a big part of our life that's complicated, my mother-in-law. She lost her first son, Jacob, in a car accident about 10 years ago. It's been tough on her, and we all tried to be as supportive as we could. But lately, things have been getting weird. It started during a family dinner. We were at our place, just the usual Sunday meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the works. My wife, her mom, Ethan, and I. The night was going fine until my mother-in-law looked at Ethan and said, "Jacob, can you pass me that?" At first, we all kind of froze. She quickly corrected herself, apologizing, saying she was just tired and made a mistake. My wife brushed it off, and I didn't think much of it. Everyone makes slips of the tongue, right? But then it kept happening. The next week, when she came over for a visit, she called Ethan Jacob again. And again. Each time, she acted like it was just another mistake, but it was starting to feel off. I mean, Ethan is only 2, so he doesn't really understand what's going on, but I could see the confusion on his face when she called him by the wrong name. It's not like he's going to correct her or anything, but I was noticing. I brought it up to my wife, told her it was happening more than just once or twice. She said it was just her mom's way of dealing with her grief. Losing Jacob had really shattered her, and maybe seeing Ethan reminded her of him. My wife assured me that her mom didn't mean any harm by it. I didn't want to push too hard, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't right. A couple of weeks later, it started to feel more deliberate. My mother-in-law came over with a bunch of toys and clothes for Ethan, which would have been a nice gesture if they hadn't all been labeled Jacob. When I asked her about it, she got defensive, saying that these were just things she'd kept from Jacob's childhood, and that it would be nice for Ethan to have them. It felt strange, though, like she was trying to put a piece of Jacob into our home. We ended up having a family gathering at our place, and it was the first time I decided to address it more directly. My mother-in-law slipped again, calling Ethan Jacob while playing with him, and this time I corrected her. I just calmly said, "His name is Ethan." She went silent, staring at me like I'd said something offensive. Then she left the room without a word. My wife shot me a look, but I thought it was necessary. A week later, things got more intense. My mother-in-law called me, crying over the phone, saying that I wasn't letting her keep Jacob's memory alive. She sounded really broken up, and I did feel bad for her. But I also couldn't help feeling like she was trying to make me feel guilty for wanting my son to be called by his own name. I told my wife about the call, and she seemed caught in the middle, saying that I needed to be more understanding of her mom's grief. Then came the day she gave Ethan a framed photo of Jacob. She said it was for Ethan's room. It felt like she was crossing a line, but my wife didn't see it that way. She thought it was sweet, a way for Ethan to learn about the uncle he never got to meet. But to me, it felt like more than that, like my mother-in-law was trying to blur the line between Ethan and her lost son. Things escalated when the daycare called. Apparently, my mother-in-law had come to pick up Ethan, and she referred to him as Jacob. The staff were confused, and they called me to clarify. I had to awkwardly explain that no, his name is Ethan, and that my mother-in-law sometimes gets mixed up. It was embarrassing, but more than that, it felt like this was starting to affect Ethan's life outside our home. That night, I told my wife we needed to set some boundaries. I suggested that maybe her mom should see a therapist to help work through her grief. My wife pushed back, saying it would only make her mother feel worse, like we thought she was crazy or something. But I was worried. I did some online research about grieving grandparents, and I realized this might be more serious than I had initially thought. There were stories about grandparents projecting their feelings onto grandkids, and it hit too close to home. A friend of mine, who's always been pretty straightforward, told me that this kind of thing could really mess with Ethan's sense of identity if it keeps up. He warned me that letting it slide could have long-term effects. That's when I really started feeling the weight of it all. I knew I had to do something, but my wife's reluctance made it even harder. Feeling stuck, I decided to post the situation on Reddit, hoping to get some outside perspective. I didn't know what to expect, but I needed advice from people who weren't so close to the situation. Maybe someone out there had dealt with something like this before. I just wanted to protect my son, but I was starting to realize that it might come at the cost of peace in my own home. Update 1. After posting on Reddit, I got a lot of responses. Some people were understanding, saying I needed to be patient with my mother-in-law because grief can mess with people in unexpected ways. But others were more direct, telling me to put my foot down and set boundaries before things got worse. A lot of them warned me that if we didn't get this under control, it could seriously mess with Ethan as he grows up. It was a mixed bag, but reading through the advice made me realize that I couldn't just keep letting things slide. I needed to address this head on. So I decided to call a family meeting. It wasn't an easy decision, but I felt like it was the right step. I talked to my wife, explained that we needed to have an open conversation with her mom, and after some back and forth, she reluctantly agreed. We invited my mother-in-law over one evening after Ethan was asleep, thinking it would be better if he wasn't around for this. When my mother-in-law came in, she seemed like she knew something serious was coming. We all sat down in the living room, and I tried to keep things calm as I explained that her calling Ethan Jacob was confusing for him. I told her that I understood how much she missed her son, but Ethan needed to grow up knowing his own identity. My wife added that we just wanted to do what's best for him. My mother-in-law didn't take it well. She broke down, crying that we were trying to erase Jacob from our lives, that this was like losing him all over again. She kept saying that Ethan was the closest thing she had to Jacob, and that calling him by that name made her feel like a part of her son was still here. It was emotional, and I could see my wife struggling to keep it together. But I knew I had to stay firm. After a lot of back and forth, we managed to reach a temporary agreement. My mother-in-law promised that she would try to call Ethan by his real name, and in return, we agreed to be more understanding of her grief. It felt like a small win, even if it didn't feel like it would stick for long. And of course it didn't. Just a few days later, I caught my mother-in-law in the backyard with Ethan. She was playing with him, but she was calling him Jacob again. I could see the way Ethan looked up at her, like he wasn't sure if she was talking to him or someone else. I stepped outside and reminded her gently about our agreement. She got quiet and then quickly left, saying she had to get home. When I brought it up to my wife, she admitted that she was getting frustrated too. She could see her mom was struggling, but she also knew this was starting to affect Ethan. Still, she felt torn. She wanted to support me, but she didn't want to hurt her mom. We tried talking about it, but every conversation just made things feel more tense between us. Not long after that, my mother-in-law showed up with an apology gift. It was a quilt made out of some of Jacob's old clothes, and she wanted to give it to Ethan. I could see the way my wife's face softened when she saw it, and she accepted it with a small smile. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. It felt like she was trying to wrap Ethan in Jacob's memory, quite literally. My friend, the same one who had warned me earlier, came over that weekend. He took one look at the quilt and shook his head. He told me that if this kept up, Ethan could start thinking of himself as someone he's not. It was another wake-up call, and I realized that this wasn't just about a name, it was about my son's sense of self. The next week, I got pulled aside by the daycare director when I went to pick up Ethan. She mentioned that he had started responding to the name Jacob sometimes when his grandma came to visit. She said they were concerned and asked if there was anything they should know about. I tried to explain it as best as I could without making it sound too strange, but I could tell they were worried. I decided to bring it up during Ethan's next pediatrician visit. I explained what had been going on, but the doctor told me that it wasn't something they could really help with, that it sounded more like a family matter. He suggested that we keep an eye on Ethan's behavior, but there wasn't much more he could do. My mother-in-law, meanwhile, started skipping our regular family gatherings. She'd text my wife, saying that she felt unwelcome, that we didn't want her around. My wife would try to reassure her, but the guilt was starting to take its toll. She'd read the messages late at night, staring at her phone like she didn't know how to make things right. Seeing how this was straining everything, I decided to book a session with a family counselor. My hope was that maybe, with a professional involved, we could work through all this without things getting worse. My wife was hesitant, worried her mom would feel attacked, but she eventually agreed. In the meantime, I posted another update on Reddit, hoping for more advice. I explained the family meeting, the backslide, and how things seemed to be falling apart, despite our best efforts. People were supportive, but a lot of them told me that this wasn't going to get better without taking a stronger stand. Some even warned that I needed to prepare for the possibility that my mother-in-law might not ever accept our boundaries. I don't know where things are headed, but I can feel it getting worse. I just hope that by getting the counselor involved, we can figure out a way to make things work before it's too late. Update 2. The first family counseling session was a disaster. We sat in a circle, me, my wife, and my mother-in-law, while the counselor tried to create a safe space for everyone to talk. It didn't take long before the counselor suggested that my mother-in-law might be projecting her grief over Jacob onto Ethan. That's when things went south. My mother-in-law got defensive, her face turning red, and she suddenly stood up, accusing the counselor of trying to take away the last bit of her son she had left. She walked out, slamming the door behind her, leaving my wife and me sitting there stunned. After the session, my wife admitted something that took me by surprise. She told me that her mother never really accepted Jacob's death. Apparently, she had kept Jacob's room almost exactly the same for years, clothes still in the closet, trophies on the shelf, and even the bed made up like he might come back any day. My wife had helped her pack up some of Jacob's things when we first got married, but a lot of it was still untouched. It made me realize just how deep my mother-in-law's grief really ran, but it also made me more worried about how this was affecting Ethan. Things took a turn for the worse when I found out about the secret visits. I came home from work earlier than usual one afternoon, and I saw my mother-in-law's car parked outside. When I went inside, I found her playing with Ethan in the living room. My wife was there too, looking tense. It was clear they hadn't expected me to walk in on them. I didn't make a scene right then, but as soon as my mother-in-law left, I confronted my wife. It turned into the biggest argument we'd ever had. I couldn't believe she'd been letting her mom come over behind my back, especially after everything that had been going on. She tried to explain that she just didn't know how to say no to her mother, that she thought it might help if her mom had some time with Ethan without me around. But all I could think was that she'd put Ethan in a confusing position again, despite everything we'd talked about. It wasn't just about trust, it was about whether I could count on her to put our son's well-being first. Things were already tense between us, but then my mother-in-law made it worse. She gave my wife an ultimatum: stop the counseling sessions, or she'd cut all contact with us. She claimed we were trying to erase Jacob's memory from the family, and she wouldn't stand for it. My wife was caught in the middle again. She broke down that night, torn between wanting to support her mom and not wanting to damage our marriage further. It was hard to see her like that, but I couldn't back down on what I thought was right for Ethan. A few days later, my mother-in-law pushed for something that crossed yet another line. She wanted Ethan to have a sleepover at her house, just one night, she said, to give us a break. I refused immediately. There was no way I was comfortable with that, not after everything that had been going on. But my wife, desperate to find some sort of middle ground, suggested maybe we could consider it. I stood my ground though, and my wife eventually sided with me. My mother-in-law did not take it well. She left our house angry, muttering that we were keeping her away from her grandson. That's when she started to involve other relatives. Suddenly, I was getting calls and texts from my wife's aunts and cousins, all asking why I was keeping Ethan from his grandmother. They told me that she'd been talking about how she felt isolated and unwelcome, and how she couldn't understand why I was being so harsh. My wife tried to explain the situation to them, but it was clear they were only hearing one side of the story. I posted a new update on Reddit, and the response was intense. Most people told me I needed to take steps to protect Ethan, even if it meant cutting my mother-in-law out entirely. Some suggested that she might try to seek legal rights as a grandparent, which I hadn't even thought about before. It scared me enough that I decided to consult a lawyer just to understand what could happen if she tried to take things to court. The lawyer explained that while grandparents' rights vary from state to state, my mother-in-law could potentially make a case for visitation if she argued that she had a close relationship with Ethan. He told me to start keeping records of everything. Every time she called him by the wrong name, every time she tried to visit without our permission, all of it. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it seemed like I had to prepare for the worst. Meanwhile, Ethan was starting to show signs of confusion. I noticed that when my mother-in-law called him Jacob, he would sometimes look up and respond, but other times he seemed lost, like he didn't understand what she was saying. It broke my heart to see him look so unsure, and I knew we couldn't keep letting this happen. Then, my mother-in-law took things public. She made a Facebook post about being kept from her only grandson, tagging some of the same relatives who had already reached out to us. It turned into a whole drama online, with people commenting and offering support to her, talking about how unfair it was that she couldn't see her grandchild. It was like she was building a whole narrative around being the victim, and it only made things more stressful. After all this, my wife and I sat down and talked. We agreed that even though the first counseling session hadn't gone well, we needed to keep going for Ethan's sake. But we decided that my mother-in-law wouldn't be involved anymore. We'd focus on building a healthier environment for Ethan and try to repair our relationship, which was barely holding together at this point. We don't know what's going to happen next, but I know one thing for sure: we need to put our son first. Update 3. After reading through some alarming comments on my last Reddit post, I realized it might be time to consider something more serious: a restraining order. People were warning me that my mother-in-law's behavior could escalate, especially with the way she had been pushing boundaries and trying to get other relatives involved. I reached out to my lawyer again, who explained what a restraining order would involve and how it could protect Ethan. But before I could make a final decision, my mother-in-law made another move. One evening, she showed up at our house unannounced. It was just after dinner, and I was in the living room when I heard her pounding on the front door. My wife looked at me, uncertain, but I knew I had to handle it. I opened the door, and there she was, demanding to see Jacob. She was upset, accusing us of keeping Ethan away from her. It was clear she wasn't going to leave peacefully, so I told her firmly that she needed to leave, and that she couldn't come around uninvited anymore. She refused to budge. She kept saying that I had no right to keep her from her grandson, raising her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I tried to remain calm, but after several minutes of her refusing to leave, I realized I didn't have a choice anymore. I called the police. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but it felt like there was no other way. When the police arrived, they talked to her for a while, trying to calm her down. Eventually, they issued her a formal warning to stay away from our property unless we invited her. My mother-in-law looked at me like I just betrayed her in the worst way possible before she left with the officers. It was a mess, and it left my wife in tears. Later that night, my wife and I argued again. She was upset that things had gotten to the point of calling the police, but I tried to make her see that it was the only way to keep things under control. She didn't disagree entirely, but it was clear that she was struggling with the idea of having to go against her own mother. A few days later, my mother-in-law made her next move. She hired a lawyer and started hinting that she might seek visitation rights. She sent a letter through her lawyer, making it clear that she believed she had a right to see Ethan, whether we liked it or not. My lawyer warned me that this could turn into a full-blown legal battle, especially given her claims of having a close relationship with Ethan. He emphasized the importance of keeping detailed records of everything, so I started writing down every encounter, every text message, and every phone call. During this time, the family counselor we'd been seeing advised that any further contact between Ethan and my mother-in-law should be closely monitored if we allowed it at all. The counselor was worried about the impact on Ethan and suggested we try to create as much stability for him as possible. I posted another update on Reddit, and people were shocked at how much my mother-in-law's behavior had escalated. Many urged me to prepare for a serious legal fight, reminding me that I had to protect my son above everything else. Some even shared stories of their own experiences with similar situations, which helped me feel a bit less alone in all of this. Around the same time, my mother-in-law started sending emotional messages to us, mostly photos of Jacob, comparing them to Ethan and insisting that Ethan was the spitting image of her late son. She sent messages saying things like, "He has Jacob's smile," or "When I look at him, it's like having Jacob back." It felt like she was trying to manipulate us into feeling guilty, but all it did was make things more tense between my wife and me. Finally, my wife reached her breaking point. After one particularly emotional message from her mother, she admitted that this had gone too far. She agreed that her mom's behavior was crossing a line and that it wasn't fair to Ethan, but she was still overwhelmed with guilt, feeling like she was abandoning her mother at a time when she needed support. We tried to arrange another mediation session through the counselor, hoping that maybe we could reach some sort of middle ground. But my mother-in-law refused to attend, insisting that the only thing she wanted was to have her grandson back. It was clear she wasn't interested in compromise, only in getting what she wanted. That's when my wife and I made the decision to cut all contact with her until further notice. We sent her a message stating that we would no longer allow any visits and that any communication needed to go through our lawyer. My mother-in-law's response came quickly, a long, emotional message accusing us of trying to erase Jacob's legacy and saying that we were turning Ethan against her. We didn't reply. In the days that followed, Ethan seemed more relaxed without the constant tension of his grandmother's visits. He played more freely, slept better, and even seemed happier at daycare. It was a relief to see, and it helped confirm that we had made the right decision, even if it had come at a high cost. I posted another update on Reddit, letting everyone know that we'd decided to go no contact. I thanked the community for their support and advice along the way. Many people were relieved to hear that we were taking a stand to protect Ethan, and some even shared their own stories of cutting out toxic family members. I know we're not out of the woods yet, especially with the possibility of a legal battle on the horizon. But for now, I'm focusing on keeping my family safe and trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy in our home. Update 4. Just as many people on Reddit had warned, my mother-in-law filed for grandparents' rights. Her lawyer submitted the request for visitation rights, arguing that she had a close relationship with Ethan and that it would be in his best interest to maintain that connection. The whole thing felt like a nightmare, but I knew we had to face it. My wife wasn't thrilled about the idea of going through with a court case. She kept hoping that there might be another way to resolve things without dragging it out in front of a judge. But after talking it over with our lawyer, she understood that we didn't have a choice if we wanted to protect Ethan. The court process started, and right away, the judge ordered a psychological evaluation for my mother-in-law. They wanted to determine if her attachment to Ethan posed any risk. It was a small relief for me because it felt like the court was taking this seriously, but it also made everything more real. We were no longer just a family dealing with a difficult situation. This was now a legal battle. A few weeks later, the hearing began. My mother-in-law took the stand and gave an emotional testimony. She talked about losing Jacob and how seeing Ethan reminded her of the child she had lost. She described Ethan as her second chance to be a mother to Jacob. Her voice cracked as she talked about how much it hurt to be separated from her grandson, and I could see that some of the people in the courtroom were moved by her words. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was twisting things to make herself look like the victim. When it was my turn to testify, I focused on the impact her behavior had on our family, and most importantly, on Ethan. I explained how she had started calling him Jacob, and how that had confused him. I mentioned the incidents at daycare, and the constant pressure she put on my wife to allow more visits. I talked about the police involvement, and the reasons why we felt it was necessary to set those boundaries. I tried to keep my emotions out of it and just stick to the facts. but it wasn't easy. We had a few character witnesses on our side, friends who had seen the strain the situation put on our family and had noticed how uncomfortable Ethan had become around his grandmother. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law had brought in a few relatives who spoke on her behalf, painting a picture of a grandmother who just wanted to be a part of her grandson's life. It was hard to hear them talk about me like I was the one causing all the problems, but I kept my focus on the goal, protecting Ethan. After hearing all the testimonies, the judge expressed concern about my mother-in-law's attachment to Ethan. He noted that her descriptions of Ethan as a second chance to be a mother to Jacob suggested that she hadn't fully dealt with her grief. He recommended that if any visits were granted, they should be supervised to ensure that Ethan's well-being remained the priority. But instead of issuing a final decision right away, the judge delayed his ruling. He said he needed more time to consider everything, leaving us in limbo. We had no choice but to wait and try to get through each day with the uncertainty hanging over our heads. I updated Reddit about the situation, sharing the details of the court proceedings and how worried I was about the outcome. People flooded the comments with support and advice, reminding me to stay strong for Ethan's sake. My wife, still hoping for some kind of resolution outside the courtroom, decided to try one last time to talk to her mother. She reached out to her and asked to meet before the final decision was made. I stayed out of it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to talk things through without everything turning into another fight. But it didn't work. They met outside the courthouse, and it ended with my mother-in-law shouting, accusing me of stealing her family and insisting that we were trying to erase Jacob's memory from our lives. My wife came home looking defeated, realizing that reconciliation just wasn't possible anymore. The rift between us and my mother-in-law had grown too wide to bridge. With the court decision still up in the air, our lawyer started preparing for the worst-case scenario. He put together an argument focusing on how any visitation could negatively impact Ethan's emotional development. Meanwhile, we took Ethan to see a child therapist, hoping to get some professional insight into how all of this might be affecting him. The therapist's advice was clear: maintaining distance from my mother-in-law would be best for Ethan's sense of stability and identity. Our extended family became even more divided during this time. Some of them reached out to my wife, accusing us of being too harsh and saying that we should let her mother have a relationship with Ethan. Others stood by us, understanding that this wasn't about keeping Ethan away, but about keeping him safe from confusion and emotional manipulation. It was tough, but my wife and I tried to focus on what really mattered: Ethan's well-being. Finally, the day came when the judge issued his ruling. He acknowledged that my mother-in-law clearly loved Ethan, but that her behavior and emotional state made it unsafe to grant her unsupervised visits. Instead, she would be allowed one supervised visit per month for the next 6 months, with the possibility of reevaluation after that. It wasn't the complete victory we'd hoped for, but it was better than the alternative. At least this way, we could ensure that Ethan wouldn't be alone with her. Now we're bracing ourselves for the supervised visits, hoping that this will be the start of some stability in our lives. I'll keep updating Reddit as things progress, but for now we're taking things one day at a time. Update 5. The supervised visits began about a month after the court's ruling. Each visit took place at a neutral location with a court-appointed supervisor present. From the start, things were tense. My mother-in-law showed up to the first visit looking determined, like she was going to prove that she deserved more than just an hour a month with Ethan. But she struggled with the boundaries that had been set. The supervisor had to remind her multiple times to keep the conversation focused on Ethan's interests and to avoid bringing up Jacob. During these visits, Ethan seemed guarded around her. He didn't seem unhappy, just distant. It was clear that the time away had already started to make a difference. At home, he was more relaxed, sleeping better, and even seemed more excited about playing with his toys and going to daycare. It was like a weight had lifted from him, and he was slowly becoming a typical, carefree toddler again. My mother-in-law, however, couldn't seem to accept the new rules. She kept pushing boundaries, trying to bring up stories about Jacob or slipping in little comments about how Ethan reminded her of him. The supervisor would step in each time, issuing warnings and redirecting the conversation. But the strain was obvious, and it made each visit feel like a powder keg waiting to explode. Despite the improvements in Ethan's behavior, my wife struggled with feelings of guilt. She would watch the visits from a distance, seeing her mother try so hard to connect with Ethan but failing to follow the rules. We would talk after each session, and she would admit that it hurt to see her mom like that. But even she couldn't ignore how much better Ethan was doing without the constant confusion about who he was supposed to be. The breaking point came during one of the later visits. My mother-in-law brought a toy truck for Ethan, which would have been fine, except it had Jacob engraved on the side in big, bold letters. The supervisor immediately flagged it, stopping the visit and pulling my mother-in-law aside to explain that this was exactly the kind of thing that went against the court's order. My mother-in-law argued, insisting that it was just a keepsake and that there was no harm in it, but the supervisor wasn't having it. She reported the incident to the court, noting that my mother-in-law was struggling to respect the boundaries that had been set. After 6 months of these visits and multiple reports of similar incidents, the court reviewed the situation. The judge read through the supervisor's notes, highlighting how often my mother-in-law had tried to bring up Jacob or give Ethan items connected to her late son. He ruled that the supervised visits weren't helping my mother-in-law to adjust, and they were only causing more strain. The decision was made to terminate the visits altogether. My mother-in-law would have no further contact with Ethan, unless we, as his parents, decided otherwise. When we heard the ruling, my mother-in-law went quiet for a while. Then, she announced that she was moving to another state to live with one of her siblings. She claimed she needed a fresh start, away from the reminders of Jacob and the hurt of being cut off from her grandson. My wife was torn, relieved that the constant tension was over, but heartbroken that things had reached this point. She'd lost the relationship with her mother, and despite everything, that loss weighed on her. In the weeks that followed, we kept up with family counseling. It wasn't easy, but we focused on repairing the cracks that the whole ordeal had left in our marriage. We both made an effort to be honest with each other about the things we had been feeling, and slowly, we started to find our way back to each other. The sessions also helped us figure out ways to support Ethan as he continued to grow and develop his own sense of self. I shared a final update on Reddit, explaining how things had turned out. I let everyone know about the court's decision, my mother-in-law's move, and how Ethan was starting to thrive without the confusion that had overshadowed his early years. A lot of people offered their support, saying they were glad to see us prioritize our son's well-being. Some shared stories of their own struggles with difficult family dynamics, which made me feel like we weren't alone in this. Ethan continued to make progress. He started talking more about his own interests, things like dinosaurs, his favorite books, and the friends he was making at daycare. He seemed to be stepping into his own little world, one where he could be just Ethan, without the shadow of another name following him around. Seeing that change in him made everything we'd been through feel worth it. Looking back, I realized how much the whole ordeal had tested us. It pushed my wife and me to the edge of what we thought we could handle. But it also made us stronger as a family. We learned how to put our son's needs above everything else, even when it meant making decisions that were painful and complicated. Now we're focusing on the future. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we're ready for whatever comes our way. For now, our priority is making sure Ethan feels safe, loved, and free to be himself, no matter what challenges might come our way. And as I told the people on Reddit, I'm just grateful that we're finally in a place where that feels possible.